Everyone. Hi. Welcome back. So excited to see everybody here. We haven't had a program here for 2 years. So grateful to see everybody here. So I can't tell you enough how happy I am to welcome you back in person for our award-winning signature programming. We're hosting the event today in our downtown Central Library location. Thrilled that you're here. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our audience at home. Those of you live streaming on the library's YouTube channel, we are happy to have you here with us as well. So that virtual aspect that I just mentioned, offering our programs to online audiences, is one of the positive things that emerged from 2 years of trying to adapt to pandemic life. So while we would have preferred to continue in person and see all of your smiling faces, we discovered the degree to which live streaming our speaking events and then archiving those, making the videos available on our YouTube channel, extended the reach of our program. So more people watching more frequently. And so as we return to in-person, we will continue to live stream as many of our events as possible. And we'll record them and archive them all. So we invite you to check out our YouTube channel. That's YouTube/KC Library, and you can see the depth and variety of our signature program that you may have missed. We've offered 121 online events in just the past 2 years, and I promise you there's some events that you'll want to catch up on. One that I'd like to call attention to that's coming up is this coming Tuesday. It's related to a wonderful exhibit here at the Central Library in the Mountain Gallery on the mezzanine level. It's featuring a collection of unique photos of famed painter Thomas Hart Benton at home and in his studio. Laura Kuykendall, an art historian at Ball State University who provided research and writing and curated the collection, discusses the images captured by photographer Thomas Mardykes and how they came to be and how they became a part of the exhibition. So we hope you'll all tune in for that next week, and you can also check out the exhibit on your way out. So for tonight's event, we welcome author of The Agitators. This is the book. It's available outside for sale. Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights by Dorothy Wickenden of The New Yorker. She explores the lives and historic contributions of 3 crucial and unlikely collaborators in the abolitionist and women's rights movements of the 19th century: Harriet Tubman, Frances Seward, and Martha Coffin Wright. Their commitment to activism and the toll it took on their families and its lasting effects on our country. There is no better time to tell this story than Women's History Month here in March. Dorothy is the executive editor of The New Yorker, also writing for the magazine and moderating its weekly podcast, The Political Scene. She was previously the national affairs editor for Newsweek and executive editor at The New Republic. And she is the author of one earlier book called Nothing Daunted: The Unexpected Education of 2 Society Girls in the West. As always, we will leave time for questions at the end, and for those of you who are here, we'll put a microphone right up here in this aisle and another microphone right over here. We ask that you please use the microphone to ask your questions so that people who are watching at home can hear the question and the answer as well. And then those of you at home, you can submit your questions via the YouTube live chat box, and we will get as many of those questions answered as well. So with that, thank you for being here and welcome back. And then please help me welcome Dorothy Wickenden.
Thank you. Oh yeah, here's my first. Thank you so much, and I too am really thrilled to see all of you here in person. I was just complaining about being a speaker on YouTube. It's a very disorienting experience when you can't actually see your audience, or sometimes when you can see your audience and you see them eating their dinner or falling asleep or whatever. So usually live audiences in this setting it's much more gratifying. So, and it's great to be in Kansas City. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Missouri and Kansas, and they play a role in the book as well. And in addition to being Women's History Month, next week is the bicentennial of Harriet Tubman's birth. So there are a lot of events around Auburn, New York, and then the Eastern Shore of Maryland where she grew up, if anybody's interested in pursuing any of that. I thought I'd begin by talking about how I got onto this story, because I'm always asked that question. So we can maybe begin there. My grandmother, Dorothy Woodruff, grew up in Auburn, which was then an industrial city right about in the middle of New York State. And she was born in 1884, so a couple generations after these women. But their legacy lived on. And I remember her very well. She was sort of in part a starchy Victorian and part this complete rebel. And I realized after I began working on this book where she got her rebellious streak. She was clearly modeling herself after these amazing women in this small city. And she became a suffragist. She went to Smith College. She became a suffragist. She talked about standing on soapboxes in Auburn, and she said nobody paid any attention to us. She and her best friend, Rosamond Underwood, this was what my first book was about, Nothing Daunted, was about her and her best friend, who came later. So The Agitators, in a way, is a prequel to that book. And I found out about these women when I was researching Nothing Daunted, because my grandmother had said in an oral history that my mother had taken of her life that her grandparents had grown up next to Lincoln's Secretary of State, William H. Seward, in Auburn. And I thought, maybe, I better check out that claim. I'd never been to Auburn. I went straight to the Seward House Museum, and the director confirmed that report. But more importantly, I got a tour of the museum, and it was the young director of education was a woman who was very intent that I learn about Frances Seward, because the museum is basically a shrine to her husband. He very important figure in 19th century history. But Frances Seward was sort of went under the radar. And this young woman told me that that Henry Seward, as she called him, that his wife, Frances, had conspired in the 1850s with these two devoted friends, Martha Coffin Wright, who lived around the corner, and Harriet Tubman, of all people, to overturn slavery and win equal rights for women. And then I learned, through her best friend, Dorothy's best friend's descendants, that when Rosamond and Dorothy were 4 or 5 years old, they were standing on South Street, which is where the museum is, and also where Rosamond's house was, and they saw Harriet Tubman ride by on a bicycle, an elderly woman. I was finishing Nothing Daunted, but I kept thinking about that story and wondering, how did Harriet Tubman, this young enslaved woman, make her way from the Eastern Shore to upstate New York, and then she spent more than 50 years of her life here? So I finished my book, but I was just riveted by that thought. And later, I learned so of course I finished the book, and then I had to find out more about this story. And I met Judith Bryant, who is a great-great-grandniece of Harriet Tubman's. And she said, I asked her about the bicycle story, and she said, no, I think it may have been a horse and cart. I don't know that Aunt Harriet, as everyone still calls her in Auburn, I don't know that she ever rode a bicycle. In any case, she would have been very elderly by then. So I began to poke around the archives, and I quickly realized that I couldn't answer the question about how Harriet Tubman had settled in Auburn without understanding this extraordinary collaboration between Frances Seward and Martha Coffin Wright. And I discovered that the story had never been told. So, of course, to a reporter and a journalist, this was just, wonderful news for me. And then as I began getting more deeply into the story of the three women, I kept hearing these contemporary echoes and of the concerns that the women were completely dedicated to. There was the abuse of women, endemic racism, conservatives attempting to silence grassroots activists, a divided society that was teetering on the edge of what is today called a civil war. So as I began putting the book together, I decided to build it around the defining personal experiences of these three women and showing them as rising up against a traditional society and intent on overturning it, which is really quite a story. I mean, this was the Second American Revolution. So my first contact was with Frances Seward. That's how she looked when she was a young married woman. So my first contact with her, I went upstairs on this first tour of the museum, and I'd gone downstairs, and the tour guide had shown me where Frances had harbored fugitive slaves, and that was amazing enough. And then I went upstairs and I talked to the director of the museum, and he said, I want to show you an early letter. He had a copy of an early letter that Frances had written in April 1831, when she was a young wife and mother. And she was desperate. You could hear the desperation in her voice. Her sister Lizette, to whom she was extremely close, was being routinely beaten by her husband, a man named Alva Worden. First of all, let me just show you, that's William Seward, portraits done by the same artist, and then this is Lizette, her beautiful, delicate young sister. Brilliant, both women were very brilliant. And one day Frances, she wrote in this letter to her husband, she was there at their house, they lived around the corner, and this young man turned on Frances too, and Frances wrote, my own dear Henry, she called him by his middle name, Worden has turned me out of the house and abused me in every possible way. He snatched away the book she was reading, threw it across the room, and started swearing at her and ordering her to go home. I mean, imagine this scene. Lizette was weeping. Worden grabbed their daughter. She screamed for her mother. And afterward, Lizette told Frances, I would leave the country if I could take my daughter with her. But she was completely trapped because women had no legal rights, none. And when they got married, they became their husband's property. That was based on British law. You were literally your husband's property. If they'd gone into the marriage with any money or property, it was their husband's immediately. So her husband, Lizette's husband, was drinking away his money. I mean, clearly these rages seemed to come when he was when he had been drinking too much. So Lizette had no access to her money, and women couldn't sit on juries, they couldn't sign a contract, make a will, of course they couldn't vote. And if a woman, I mean, divorce was almost unheard of, and if a woman did pursue divorce, she lost any rights to her children, her reputation, everything. And so as a result, most women who were caught in abusive relationships were too cowed or too ashamed to speak about it at all. So Frances, who had been very protected, as had Lizette, but very well brought up, extremely good education, she was completely horrified and emboldened. And she thought in such cases, women should have the right to divorce and to retain custody of their children. So she wrote to her husband, men have framed laws, I believe, to uphold themselves in their wickedness. And she couldn't help Lizette, so she had to ask Henry, who was in Albany, he had to come home and help her and her sister. Then, a few years later, she had another epiphany about acute social injustice. She had always opposed slavery, but really had never felt its full force until the summer of 1835 because she had never been south before. And she and Henry her health wasn't good, so they took a summer trip to the south on the recommendation of their doctor. And she wrote in her journal, she noticed as they traveled south that the roads became rougher and the South was not built up in an industrial way. There were these big plantations. And she wrote in her journal one day, when they stopped at a tavern north of Richmond, that they had heard the sounds of they were in the carriage, and they heard the sounds of weeping and moaning and saw 10 naked little boys tied together by their wrists and fastened to a long rope. And they watched with horror as a tall man, white man, of course, holding a whip, led them to a horse trough to drink, and then to a shed where they lay down, sobbing themselves to sleep. So the slave trader was taking them to Richmond, where they would be sold at auction, and they were just a few of the tens of thousands of people Virginia supplied to the cotton and rice fields of the Deep South every year. Virginia was the biggest slaveholding state. Frances was incredibly sensitive, and she was undone by this experience. And she wrote in her journal, slavery, slavery, the evil effects constantly coming before me and marring everything. And by the time she got back to Auburn, she was a committed abolitionist. I thought this was incredible material right from the time I saw that first letter. Yet I found out that nobody had written in depth about Frances ever. So and then I was infuriated. I found out that William Seward's first biographer, Glendon Van Dusen, a very respectable historian, he had published his book in 1965, and he dismissed Frances as a neurotic invalid. Clearly, that couldn't be exactly the case, even from the tiny bit that I knew at the time. And she did suffer from what today would be known as migraine headaches and clinical depression. And she was an avowed homebody. She was ill. In those days, women secluded themselves when they weren't feeling well. So everyone, all the subsequent biographers too, basically until Doris Kearns Goodwin came around and wrote Team of Rivals, just followed Glendon Van Dusen's lead and just thought she was not worth any notice. So I found out when I went to the Seward papers, which are at the University of Rochester, that her letters were still essentially untouched. And a curator there told me that when they were donated, the then librarian put them aside as worthless. So, you know, one person's worthless collection is another person's gold, and they were gold to me. And one of the curious things about Frances and her husband was that they mostly lived apart. She stayed in Auburn. She loved her house when he moved to Washington. And they wrote to each other several times a week. So there was a voluminous correspondence. And a lot of the correspondence of William Seward had been combed over. People just hadn't looked at her letters. And to me, I started reading those letters, and she felt eerily alive, you know, a couple of hundred years later. And not only did she provide a vivid perspective on marriage and motherhood, which also has been traditionally overlooked, sort of what was called social history. Those kinds of details have been overlooked in traditional histories, but also really sharp accounts on the tumultuous antebellum era and the Civil War. As I said, she was extremely well educated for a young woman of that era, and she was a just voracious reader. She read everything from Thucydides to abolitionist leaflets. And so she had this sheltered conservative upbringing, and she had these reclusive tendencies, but she became an activist, and that took a lot of courage from her. It sort of started building with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed slave catchers to travel to free states and hunt down runaways, as they called them, and required citizens and police to deliver suspected fugitives to federal commissioners. And slavery had been legal in New York, as in many northern states, for a long time, but it had been abolished, you know, decades and decades earlier. So that was just an abomination to New Yorkers across the state. And the question for Frances was not whether she would violate the new law. She knew she would, but how? How could she do that? So Henry, by then, in 1850, was a US senator, and she became his private political advisor. And I could see, as I read these letters back and forth, that she began by delivering regular reports to him about how people in the state, his constituents, were rebelling against this new law. And she clipped and saved key lectures from abolitionist newspapers in Boston, and so that when he would read them when he came home. And for more than a decade, she said, you must listen to the abolitionists. We cannot, and he was anti-slavery. He just wasn't quite as out there as she was. So she had married him when she was just 19 years old. She was just a girl. She was very cosseted, and he was a very ambitious 24-year-old lawyer. And she'd assumed that they would live a very quiet life in Auburn. They both loved to garden. They loved to read. They shared a lot of the same interests. She thought they'd raise their children and just live together and have a very quiet life. But he soon made it clear to her that she was very wrong. And he said that politics was the most important business in the country, and that he wasn't suited to the law. As he said, I fear, abhor, detest, despise, and loathe litigation. So that was that for the law for him. And Frances, unfortunately for both of them, despised and loathed politics. So when he was elected to the Senate in 1850 and went to Washington, so that is a view of Pennsylvania Avenue basically from the White House looking toward the unfinished Capitol. She insisted in staying in her father's house, where she had grown up, and where she continued to live even after she got married and after she had her children, and she lived with her father and her grandmother and her aunt until they all died, and then she inherited the house. She really hated the capital. It was a southern city where slavery was legal, and men, women, and children were routinely led in chains down the mall to one of the city's jails before being sold at auction. So this was roughly what the mall looked at the time, and there were these slave houses right on the mall. And then this was one of the jails where they were held before they were sold. So Henry had one condition when he agreed to this very unconventional marital arrangement. He insisted that she come down to serve as his hostess during the city's social season, which took place every winter, when he threw incredibly lavish parties for politicians, journalists, and socialites several times a week. It was 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a week. And so she did her duty, and she went down and stayed with him during those months. And she spent most of her time doing things that she absolutely hated, drawing up guest lists, planning these menus. It was 10 courses. I mean, it's just sort of unimaginable now, shopping for provisions, doing the seating charts. And she was just revolted by the contrast between the Washington elites and the enslaved. So these slides will give you a sense of what her social life was like. During the day, she had no interest in entertaining or clothes, but she had to dress formally in the morning for visiting and receiving guests, a sort of rough approximation of that, and more so each evening, where she put her hair in a braided bun. She had those breath-constricting corsets that were reinforced with light steel. You could barely breathe, and those enormous hoop skirts, which she thought were preposterous. And then she had to exchange pleasantries for hours and hours on end. Henry loved all this. He was incredibly convivial, great host, and he just loved trading barbs with Northern and Southern colleagues. He thought this was the way to get ahead, which it obviously was. She found it almost impossible to talk to people that she had nothing in common with. And during her first winter there, she wrote to Lizette, "It is the life to which I am doomed." Oh, and that's just so sad to think of that. It took her 9 years to get up the courage to tell him that she would not be his hostess anymore. And so Auburn was better, as she loved her home, she loved her family, but even there, it was a very conservative town, and she had only one friend who shared her passionate support for women's rights and her opposition to slavery, and that was Martha Coffin Wright. And she looked so demure in that early photograph, or actually it was it was the predecessor of photographs, I'm forgetting the word. She was just a born rebel. You can kind of see it in her twinkly, sparkly eyes. But it took her years as well to break the constraints that bound women to their offspring and their husbands. So the rules and the propaganda about what was called women's sphere just seemed inescapable. One poem of the time portrayed the ideal wife as a bright sunbeam in high or lonely home, the recipient, the writer said, of the greatest right of all, to comfort man on earth and smooth his path to heaven. Francis and Martha, they scorned all of this, but it was completely pervasive, and they didn't have any apparent power to change the status quo. What could they possibly do? Martha's husband, David, was a local lawyer, and she really envied him. She would read his law books. She found them fascinating, and he traveled a lot for his work. He was a patent attorney. He was constantly going back and forth, and she was stuck at home. By the mid-1840s, she had 6 small children, and she could barely get out the door. Frances was born to wealth. She was an aristocrat who had a house full of servants to cook, clean, and help care for her 4 children. But Martha had a tight budget, and she did all of her own housework. So for my portrait of her, I began with an academic biography by a couple named Sherry Penny and James Livingston, who had quoted from some of her remarkable letters to her much older sister, the Quaker, infamous Quaker minister and human rights activist, Lucretia Mott. She was about 14 years older. Lucretia lived in Philadelphia, where she was a leader in the abolitionist movement, and she worked and socialized with a very small integrated group of other insurgents. Nobody else would have anything to do with her. And Martha, meanwhile, had these young children, and she wrote to Lucretia all the time. And she wrote, "The only way is to grub and work and sweep and dust and wash and dress children and make gingerbread and patch and darn." She wrote in one of her letters that just bathing 3 of her youngest children took her 3 hours one afternoon, and she had to change the hay and the mattress. I mean, there are all kinds of details about what it was like to be a housewife at the time. She loved her children, but it was really exhausting. When she could slip out, she stopped at Frances's house because Frances had this magnificent library, her library and her husband's library. And so Martha was constantly borrowing books and pamphlets, and they would sit down and talk. Martha had stopped going to school at the age of 15, but she too was an insatiable reader, very, very sharp. And so she would borrow some books. It was like a lending library. Then she'd bring them back and she'd take some more. And they talked, of course, about their frustrations with their children and their husbands, and they talked about their subversive beliefs. And this is how agitation begins. Frances had been following Lucretia Mott for a very long time and really admired her because she traveled around the country giving fiery talks. She was a Quaker, and Quakers believed that women should get out there and speak if they wanted to. Women otherwise did not speak in public at all. And so Frances thought that was really great. And so she was just completely defying that social prohibition. And Martha, increasingly and unsurprisingly, modeled herself on Lucretia. Then in 1843, she decided, okay, I'm really going to do something now. And she followed her sister's example and joined the Underground Railroad, turning her basement kitchen, which was the symbolic heart of woman's sphere, into a place of political asylum. Frances couldn't do that for a couple of years because her crunchy, crusty old father was still alive. But after he died, she did the same thing. And they found harboring slaves a very satisfying way of enacting one of their beliefs, knowing, of course, that they were breaking the law. And Frances had learned a lot as she was growing up about how the railroad worked from 2 of her servants, Harriet and Nicholas Bogart, who had once themselves been enslaved. Harriet Bogart had delivered Frances's children, Lizette's daughter. The Bogarts helped Frances expand her Underground Railroad connections and Martha's, as did Luke Freeman, who was a black barber who ran the whole network in Auburn. And he owned, there was a small but important black middle class at that point in Auburn. And he owned a couple of properties across the street from Frances. So Henry Seward insisted that Frances follow the rules, which were very much Southern rules when she was in Washington, but he allowed her to do what she wanted when she was in Auburn. So at one point she was away and he went back to Auburn and he wrote to her, "The Underground Railroad works wonderfully. 2 passengers came here last night." So again, these are some of the details you get when you just read these letters. You have to go through a lot of them, but the little gems are there. Martha was just furious, as so many at the time were, that women in the North, they were subjected to what was essentially house arrest. But she was also incredibly funny, and this is one of the things I loved about her. She used her correspondence with Lucretia as an outlet. It was kind of a way to transform her rage into a kind of humor that was very biting and acerbic. So she had been kicked out of the Society of Friends for various reasons that I explain in the book, because she hadn't abided by those rules, but she practiced Quakerism at home, instilling her beliefs in her children as she wanted them to learn them. She didn't take them to church, so her neighbors called her an infidel. And this is hard. I mean, she was really ostracized, but she just forged ahead. And so the Auburn Theological Seminary was not far away, and young men who were studying there came by often to proselytize, and they warned her about the dire fate of women who didn't devote Sundays to God. She replied that she didn't believe in forcing her family to read the Bible. Through Lucretia, she'd gotten to know the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who was the head of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And she put a stack of those pamphlets near the front door, and she told the seminarians that she would only read their tracts if they would read hers. And she wrote to Lucretia, these ascetics give religion such a repulsive character. I wonder who was ever made better by the perusal of such nonsense. I was just withering, you know. She loved puns, so her letters are full of puns. And in another letter, she wrote about beating eggs with a quill, as another housewife had recommended. And of course, she made a hideous mess. The feathers were all coated and drooping with the yolk. And she concluded that the idea must have been invented by a goose. My nice wire egg beater is good enough for me. But Lucretia was sort of a mother figure to her and had helped to raise her and everything. And she was kind of stern and solemn. And she warned Martha, don't cultivate mirthfulness at the expense of other faculties. And Martha replied, people love to laugh. If it weren't for the blessed organ of mirthfulness, what would become of us all? What indeed? So William Seward believed, at least nominally, in women's rights, but David Wright emphatically did not. Martha made all of the family clothes. It's you know, imagine that for a family of 8, you know, doing all of that. There were no sewing machines. It was all done by hand. She always had a stack of clothes that needed mending or needed making. They finally had enough. After years, they finally had enough money to hire a seamstress named Miss Soule. And she told David it was unfair to pay Miss Soule half of what he paid his hired man to help him with his outdoor chores. She said women too should be able to save up for old age when they couldn't work anymore. And David replied that equal wages would be a curse to the community. And Martha wrote to Lucretia, he refused to argue anymore. He went off in a huff to hoe his corn or cut asparagus. And you know, I love this. This was like 1840. It was almost 125 years before the Equal Pay Congress got around to passing the Equal Pay Act. And many women still don't make, most women still don't make what men earn. So in July 1848, Martha finally revolted in public. She was 41 years old and pregnant with her 7th child. It was a baby she was frank about not wanting at all. At a gathering, she was 6 months pregnant. At a gathering in Waterloo, Martha, Lucretia, and 3 other women, Jane Hunn, Marianne McClintock, and crucially, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they all started talking about all of these outrages, and they decided they just couldn't abide by these laws that men had created to keep women in their place anymore. And so they organized the Seneca Falls Convention. The first public meeting devoted solely to women's rights. I read a lot of scholarly accounts of Seneca Falls, but I thought, I just loved approaching it through Martha because I could see how it catalyzed her and then, of course, how it ended up over the decades catalyzing other women. So over the 2 days of the convention, she befriended 2 people who completely changed her life. She thought her life was over. She thought she was a mother, she was a grandmother at 41, and that was that, and then she was just like a housewife. Then she got to know Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was quite a bit younger than she was, a total firebrand who just, you know, did not know the meaning of the word compromise. And she met the abolitionist Frederick Douglass. So Stanton was the driving force at Seneca Falls. She insisted that the right to vote should be among the women's demands. Lucretia, who had been at this work for years and years, thinking that would only hurt their cause by pressing for a goal that everyone thought was ridiculous. She told Stanton, Lizzie, thou wilt make the convention ridiculous. The organizers personally invited Douglass, who was known to be favorable about women's rights, and he had just started an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star in Rochester. And Martha made sure to get to know him. She really admired him. She subscribed to the North Star. She knew all about him. He was world famous. And then he wrote in his report of Seneca Falls, without any caveats, there can be no reason in the world for denying women the exercise of the elective franchise. And Martha ended up agreeing with Stanton and Douglass, not with Lucretia. So she was breaking away from her older sister for the first time. And Stanton immediately enlisted Martha in what was the incipient women's rights movement. She made herself the head of it. I mean, you know, she just sort of took charge. And then Douglass drew Martha further into abolition. Susan B. Anthony came along a couple years later. Douglass, in addition to running the newspaper, he was out on the lecture circuit all the time. talking about abolition, and he went back and forth across the state, and whenever he went through Auburn, Martha invited him to come to the house and come for dinner or to spend the night, which again was not to be done in polite society. And after one of his visits, Martha attended a bridal party in Auburn where she wrote to Lucretia, she was asked with the slightest possible sneer about our recent guests. The woman wanted to be informed whether we gave them the best room. She replied, certainly. So again, this just shows racism was so pervasive. And again, you know, slavery had been legal not so very long ago in the North as well. And then at another party in town, Martha overheard two guests gossiping. One asked, who is that fine-looking lady? And the other replied, that is Mrs. David Wright. She is a very, very dangerous woman. And, you know, to their mind, she really was. And she was, you know, when we see what they went on to do. And that brings us, at last, to Harriet Tubman. I love this photograph, which was discovered only a couple of years ago in a photo album of a woman named Emily Howland, who was a very close friend of Frances, Martha, and Harriet. So it's now in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington. So it just shows there's constantly, people squirrel away things, and then suddenly something emerges in some attic or some basement. So I found Harriet's story more challenging to tell, despite her fame, and there's been a lot of good sleuthing by scholars in recent years. And I particularly relied on the work of Kate Larson, who's become the most prominent biographer of Tubman. And I got to know her during my years of research. She was incredibly generous, and among other things, she took me on a tour of the parts of the Eastern Shore where Harriet had grown up and where she returned to conduct her Underground Railroad operations. By the time she met Martha and Frances, probably around 1850, 1851, they were insurgents, and they were ready to help in the cause of women's rights and abolition in any way they could. Tubman had liberated herself in 1849 when she learned that she was about to be sold to a slaveholder in the Deep South. So she left behind her free husband, John Tubman, and her parents and sibling, two brothers, because they said it was too dangerous to go with her. They wouldn't risk their life doing something so foolish. So she went alone. She just left them. She walked 100 miles to Philadelphia. She'd learned a lot that it was a free city. There were schools for black children. There were these abolitionists who talked about upending slavery. So that was her goal, and she had learned, she was illiterate, but she had kind of mapped out the way in her mind. She had learned about how the Underground Railroad worked through her parents, who were also agents on the local part of the railroad on the Eastern Shore. So she found her way to Philadelphia, where she was assisted by something called the city's Vigilance Committee. It was founded by a friend of Lucretia's called Robert Purvis. And these committees were then subsequently formed in cities across the North, including in Auburn. And they provided food, shelter, money, clothing, and medical and legal help, whatever was needed by people who were coming up from the South and trying to get away from slavery. Purvis, who knew Lucretia very well, he teasingly said that she was the most belligerent, non-resistant, meaning pacifist, he had ever seen. And she said, I glory in it, the description. So as Harriet began to plot her incursions into the Eastern Shore to free her family and friends, she met Lucretia. This was a very tight-knit little group. She was a young Methodist. Lucretia was an older Quaker, but they had a lot in common. And probably the most important thing was they both believed that they were directly guided by the voice of God. So they became friends. And abolitionists, of course, had to utterly depend on trustworthy associates in both slave and free states. This was really dangerous work. And Harriet really intended to rescue her entire family and as many enslaved friends as she could, and she did. So she totally ignored the advice of the more seasoned abolitionists in Philadelphia, who told her it simply wasn't possible. And she set out to expand her network of contacts in the North. So there's no record of how she met the Auburn women, but it's pretty clear that Lucretia introduced Martha to her when Martha was making a family visit to Philadelphia, and then Martha in turn introduced Harriet to Frances in Auburn, and that was a perfect place for her to stop, right in central New York State, sort of between Syracuse and Rochester. So Martha's and Frances's basement kitchens became regular stops for Harriet and for other fugitives who were moving north, often up to Canada. And these women began to depend on and really motivate each other. And it's the kind of history I really like to tell, kind of zooming in on individual people to show, in this case anyway, how social change is actually made by people who, one would assume couldn't possibly do it. And Frances and Martha, like basically everybody who met her, were totally transfixed by the story of her life. They were frustrated with their husbands for all kinds of reasons, but it never would have occurred to them to strike out on their own. And Harriet had made that solitary walk to Philadelphia, expecting that when she returned to Maryland, John Tubman would accompany her back north. Instead, she discovered when she went back for him, he had taken another wife. This was 2 years later, and she had been thinking nonstop about this. She had been saving her money, and she was completely stricken. But she told another friend, she said, I dropped him out of my heart. And she took other people who wanted to go with her. He was gone, she moved on, and that was the beginning, really, of her, of that chapter of her life. So she was tiny. She was like 5 feet tall, completely fearless, lots younger than Frances and Martha. And to them, she just embodied the urgency of abolition. And when the Fugitive Slave Act passed, she later said, I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people no longer. I brought them all clear off to Canada. So she would make these stops across New York State, and then she'd go on up to Canada. And because she couldn't read or write, I just didn't have the resources that I did in the letters of the other two, and I really wanted to bring her to life. I felt, when I was in 8th grade, I read the little section in my history book about her being an Underground Railroad conductor, but I didn't know that much more about her. And I did all this reading, and I finally concluded that she was such a superb strategist in every way that she made sure to leave behind an oral history. And so I began to look at contemporaneous accounts of what she had told others. And a lot of people took down literally what she said. And she told her story again and again, privately in the beginning when it was too dangerous to talk in public. And then as the 1850s went on and some of the revolts became more overt and she got to know the wealthy abolitionists in Boston, she told them in public as a way of raising money for her journeys back to Maryland. And she did not deliver dry lectures like Boston's transcendentalists or like the abolitionist preachers who were sort of deadly dull. She was an incredible raconteur. This little small woman, she was incredibly animated. She wore just a homespun dress and kerchief, and white audiences were entranced. She acted out of her life. She interspersed scenes of violent abuse with bits of scripture. She sang baritone renditions of Negro spirituals, and then one of the things she liked to do best was tell stories about how she outwitted former, so-called masters, and she was really good at that too. I mean, she had some very close calls, but they never caught her. And one of the Boston philanthropists whom she became very close to, Edna Dow Cheney, wrote that she played all the parts and the scene rises before you as she saw it, and her voice and language change with her different actors. She couldn't remember her oldest sister, who was sold when she was 3 years old. 2 other sisters had been leased away by their enslaver as their mother pleaded for mercy. So think about how this story affected Frances and Martha with their very close ties to their sisters. Harriet had scars on her neck from whippings by a sadistic woman who refused to instruct her in how to do her chores, and then thrashed her repeatedly for failing to do them to her liking. She had periodic blackouts from a head injury she'd suffered when an overseer had been following an enslaved young man, and they were in a dry goods store, and he picked up an iron weight on the counter, and he threw it at this young man, and it hit Harriet in the head instead. And it cracked her skull, and she had problems for the rest of her life, which she called the trouble in her head, terrible, terrible headaches and visions that she considered prophetic. It was a kind of neurological response, I guess. And she had somehow memorized long passages of the Bible. Frances, so there was a lot of religion embodied in all of this. A lot of the abolitionists were evangelical Christians. A lot of them were Quakers. Frances was an observant Episcopalian, and she thought Harriet brought to mind Isaiah. Forget the former things, do not dwell in the past. I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Given our location tonight, I just want to pause for a very quick overview of the role that Missouri and Kansas played in precipitating the Civil War. Some of you, I'm sure, know this history, so this will be a really quick gloss. But it really, the people back east were following this, you know, every day. They were reading the newspapers because there were correspondents out here following it and reporting back. So the country, it was mid-1850s, the country was splitting apart over slavery, and most of the action was taking place right near here in the guerrilla war called Bleeding Kansas. The 1854 Kansas Nebraska Act enabled voters in the Western Territories, as Kansas was at that point, to decide for themselves whether they would permit slavery in their new states. And so a large migration began of settlers from the Northeast, subsidized by abolitionists, to head to Kansas to make sure that there would be enough people to vote, men to vote, so that when Kansas entered the Union, it would enter as a free state. Missourians and Southerners sent people as well, but they were determined to make it a slave state. Missouri was a slave state. They wanted Kansas to be a slave state. The Northeasterners who founded the town of Lawrence, I love this image. In its early days, 1854, 1855, thatched, you know, little thatched huts and everything. So that's Lawrence in the beginning, and before they knew it, they were facing off against pro-slavery militias, which were led by Missouri Senator David Rice Atchison. These militias were dubbed border ruffians by the Northern press, and they vowed they produced their own newspapers, and they vowed, as they put it in one, to lynch and hang, tar and feather, and drown every white-livered abolitionist who dares to pollute our soil. And Martha, you know, she reads all this stuff in the papers, and she told an Auburn friend that she expected the pioneers to maintain their ground manfully and not be driven off by the idle threats of the Missourians. But in 1855, the day before the first legislative elections, 1,000 well-armed ruffians crossed the border carrying pre-printed ballots. They fanned out to all of the free state towns, stuffing ballot boxes and accosting voters and election judges. The Free Staters, of course, were up in arms themselves. They refused to accept the results. It was a patently fraudulent election, and they established a rival government in a different town and began to write their own constitution, which would be Free State. The actual government, of course, was producing a slave state constitution. Bleeding Kansas was huge national news. It further inflamed what was already a national frenzy over slavery. And on May 19th, 1856, Frances had just one friend in Washington, and he was an abolitionist senator named Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. And he didn't believe in restraint himself, and he went and rehearsed this speech in front of Frances and Henry. Henry was a friend of his too. Anyway, this long, 3-hour speech, which he memorized somehow. It was called The Crime Against Kansas, which eviscerated his pro-slavery Democratic colleagues. Democrats were the conservatives in those days, and President Franklin Pierce for their complicity in what he called the incredible atrocity of the assassins and of the thugs. 2 days later, so again, that's the East, and then back here, 2 days later, the border ruffians, led by a local sheriff, sacked the Free State town of Lawrence. And there it is, the sacking of Lawrence in May 1856. The following day, the South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks approached Sumner in the well of the Senate. He was sitting bent over the desks, were very small, they still are, bent over his desk, franking a stack of printed copies of the speech he had just given, which he was going to mail to sympathizers. But before he could stand up, Brooks began striking him with his cane with such force that it splintered. And I'm sure we all learned this in our history books too, but just to see it from the Seward's point of view is pretty interesting. So Brooks remarked, of course this was a huge triumph for him and the South, Brooks remarked, "I wore my cane out completely, but saved the head, which is gold." And Sumner, he practically killed him, and he was carried home unconscious. Frances was completely aghast. You know, her close friend, Charles, as she called him, was almost killed, and she was appalled by the savagery of the Missourians. And she wrote that to a friend in Auburn when she was in Washington, that the events had deepened that furor in my soul. So as the book began to come together, this was really interesting to see how these protagonists responded to national events. And I could see exactly how they were helping and influencing each other, and of course, then getting more and more radical as the country began to become more inflamed. So by the spring of 1859, Frances decided that she had to do more to undermine slavery. Martha, by then, was organizing conventions for women's rights and for abolition all the way across New York State, braving hecklers and mobs. There were, Bibles were thrown at them, stones were thrown through windows. Police had to sit up on the podium with the window with loaded pistols in their laps. It was really wild. And Harriet, of course, was repeatedly risking her life. She eventually made a dozen trips to the Eastern Shore. She rescued even her elderly parents, who were in their 70s, took them all the way to St. Catharines, Canada, and the rest of her family, where she lived with them when she wasn't on one of her missions. And Frances, one of the things they shared was a love of family. And she knew that Harriet's parents were unwell and very unhappy. They hated Canada, and it was cold, and her father had, I don't know, lumbago or something. I can't remember what it was. And they were almost totally dependent on Harriet. The other children in the family somehow did not have her drive, and everyone thought of Harriet as the boss. So Frances, after hearing all these stories, decided that Auburn would be a more convenient location for Harriet's family, the Ross family. And when her father died, he'd left her a lot of land. And in 1848, the state legislature had finally passed something called the Married Women's Property Act, thanks to decades of lobbying by early women and the women's rights advocates long before Seneca Falls. And the new law enabled the women of New York, the wives, to control their own inheritances. One of the parcels Frances owned, about a mile from the Seward house on South Street, included 7 acres, a frame house, a barn, and a couple of outbuildings. Historians I saw, as I was reading about this, always attributed the sale to William Seward. But it's clear to me that it was Frances who made the decision. Of course it was Frances. Harriet was Frances's friend. It was her land. It was her decision. It wasn't Seward's decision. He was in Washington most of the time. And it's really hard to emphasize how subversive an act this was. At the time, women still rarely sold property, let alone to fugitive slaves. And Frances was going to be flouting the Fugitive Slave Act just as Henry was beginning a bid for the presidency, which was his long in the making goal. This was something he really hoped to do. He hoped in 1860. But it was also interesting to me that she and Henry had been integrating Auburn for years by selling plots of land and houses to black families in town. If you're a black man, you could vote in New York if you had $250 worth of property. So that was their way of trying to help black families move toward full citizenship. So Frances, I believe, saw the sale of this property to Harriet as just an extension of that undertaking, and her husband could hardly object to it. So the Seward's youngest son, Will, who was starting a banking career in Auburn, helped Frances drop the paperwork for the mortgage. Conveniently for Henry, the sale was completed in the spring of 1859 when he was on an 8-month tour of Europe, Palestine, and Egypt. He had nothing to do with it. She consulted with him, obviously, but Martha, meanwhile, took in Harriet and 6 men, women, and children on what turned out to be her final Underground Railroad journey. They were followed very closely for much of the way, and there are accounts of this by a close contact Harriet had in Delaware. So again, piecing together sort of how she did this and where she stopped and what happened along the way. But Martha, meanwhile, wrote to her spoiled youngest daughter, Ellen, who was at a fancy finishing school in Lenox, Massachusetts, that one woman had held a baby in her arms the entire way while Harriet and the men helped along the other children. So you can probably see a little bit of that. That's a copy of that letter. She wrote, "They walked all night carrying the little ones and spread the old comforter, on the frozen ground in a thicket where they all hid while Harriet went out foraging and sometimes could not get back until dark, fearing she would be followed." Frances's relationship with Harriet, of course, made her even more intolerant of the unsavory trade-offs that are necessary in politics. Here, I love this shot too. This is just her seemingly peacefully reading in her garden while she's, doing all kinds of things behind the scenes. In 1861, so obviously Lincoln did not become president. He did not get the nomination. Lincoln got the nomination in 1861. He was elected president, and he asked Seward to be his Secretary of State. Seward was bitterly disappointed, but he took the job, and he gave his final speech in the Senate, and that's what he looked like at the time. 7 slave states at that point had already seceded, and the goal of the incoming administration was not emancipation, but restoration of the Union. And Seward and Lincoln thought almost identically on this issue, and on many issues. Seward explained in this final speech in the Senate, "In political affairs, we cannot always do what seems to us absolutely best." Boy, that prompted a really scorching letter from Frances. And this is where, again, nobody having looked at these letters was such a gift to me. So she accused him of abandoning convictions he'd held his entire life. That's her letter. Compromises based on the idea that the preservation of the Union is more important than the liberty of nearly 4 million human beings cannot be right. And again, this was a real minority view. This was not a popular cause at the time, even in the North. It had become more so in the 1850s as Southerners began to infiltrate in the North and try to bring fugitive slaves back into slavery. But they were radicals. And the war years, all 3 women were very pro-war. Martha abandoned all Quaker pacifism. She decided that what did she call it? The spirit of the sword sometimes was more effective than something of the spirit. And Lucretia disagreed with her about that, but Martha was in all the way. But it meant that Martha's son, Willie, went off to fight. He fought heroically at Gettysburg. I have a whole chapter about that, which was just phenomenal stuff I was able to pull together. And Frances's son, Will, with a very bushy beard, who also fought heroically at the Battle of Monocacy in Maryland. It was a battle I had never heard of, but it was an incredibly important battle, which I also write about at some length. Harriet, you will not be surprised to hear, joined the war. She told Martha that she intended to assist the Union Army in occupied South Carolina by doing what she called a kind of secret service. Indeed, she figured out a way. She got the governor of Massachusetts' permission to go down there. You had to get permission by a governor in order to go through Army lines. She got to know all of the officers down there. I'll get to that in a second, but this is quite interesting. She cited the book before she left, she cited the book of Exodus to one friend to explain her decision. And she said, "The good Lord has come," this friend wrote about this, "the good Lord has come down to deliver my people, and I must go help him." And she must have said just about the same thing to Frances, who wrote to Henry before Harriet departed, "I think we may safely assume that the cry of the oppressed has reached the ear of God and that he has come down to deliver them." So there it is. You can tell how they were talking to each other. In an indication of just how much Harriet trusted Frances, she left a beloved 10-year-old niece named Margaret Stewart. She had no children of her own, in Frances's care for the 3 years she served in the war. And Harriet did work for the Army as a spy master. She got to know these local commanders. She got money from them to pay 8 scouts to work for her. Then she delivered the intelligence they gave to her about movements of enemy troops. They were surrounded on 3 sides by the rest of South Carolina, which was not occupied by Union troops. Very dangerous. And then she accompanied the abolitionist Colonel James Montgomery and his regiment of black soldiers, which were the 2nd Black Regiment in the Civil War, on one of 3 gunboats in a completely spectacular river raid called the Comby River Raid. And this was published in Harper's, this drawing. There was this correspondent there at the time. So there again, there was a kind of, I had a correspondence firsthand account of the event, and then I had other things that I could draw on to bring it all to life. And it was really fun. This chapter was really fun to work on. I went down to Beaufort, where Harriet lived, and asked Jeff Grigg, who was a local author, and I had found just this little self-published book, basically, that he had written. He had spent 25 years researching the Comby River Raid, and he runs a boatyard down there, and he took a whole day, and he showed me all around the territory. So I really got a sense of how it was done and where they were. It was a really audacious attack on 4 rice plantations along the water. It was executed almost flawlessly. They burned down the plantations. Again, I mean, this is total war. This is the way they did it. Flooded the rice fields and returned with 750 freed slaves. It was a real triumph. Harriet was just ecstatic. She went back to Auburn after the war, and a few years later, she told her first biographer, Sarah Bradford, who lived in a nearby town, about the sight from the gunboats at one landing. And Bradford took down her account verbatim. And I just have to quote this little part because it just shows her sense of language, and it can't be improved upon. This is Harriet Tubman. She says, "Here you'd see a woman with a pail on her head, rice a-smoking in it just as she'd taken it from the fire, young one hanging on behind, one hand round her forehead to hold on, the other digging into the rice pot, eating with all its might." Again, you see her sense of humor in this too. "Hold of her dress, 2 or 3 more, down her back, a bag with a pig in it. Woman brought 2 pigs, a white one and a black one. We took them all on board. Named the white pig Beauregard, after the Confederate general, and the black pig Jeff Davis, the president of the Confederacy. She called the people fleeing the children of Israel coming out of Egypt." So this was what she'd gone down there to do. And of course, as she set out, she always set out to do something, she always did it. So I finished the book, and afterward, I had not been to the cemetery where the 3 women are buried, and I really wanted to see it. So it's called Fort Hill Cemetery. I'd heard a lot about it from my grandmother because my grandmother grew up in a house that was right at the foot of the cemetery, and you go up a long, winding driveway and tall hill, and then just 83 acres of heavily forested land. It's really a beautiful, sprawling park. And I actually had to have someone help me find the grave sites. It's so large. So I stopped first at Francis's and Martha's graves, and I thought about what they'd accomplished against these seemingly impossible odds, and also how they'd been all but forgotten after they died. I mean, it just seemed outrageous. And Harriet Tubman lived on for decades. I mean, this woman was completely unstoppable. So after she came back, she lived in Auburn, as I said, for almost 50 years. She returned to the lecture circuit to talk about the war, to talk about women's suffrage, and about human rights, and about rights for poor black people in particular. She was active well into the 20th century, long enough that her life overlapped briefly with my grandmother's. And I finally found her modest gravestone under a towering spruce tree. It's very small. There's some writing on the back explaining what she had accomplished. And I was really touched. Visitors had left along the top of the stone tiny pine cones, a handful of little smooth rocks, 2 bunches of wild daisies, and 3 pennies showing Lincoln's, that gaunt profile. And I wanted to see it again, and so I went back just a couple of months ago when things started opening up again. I went back to Auburn to give a book talk, And I left early on a Sunday morning, and on my way out of town, I stopped again at Harriet's grave, and this time I had a bunch of flowers, and I took a photo. There it is. And it obviously had different remembrances this time. You see the black COVID mask, but again, there's still some pine cones and a rustic cross. Anyway, so she lives on in people's hearts and minds, and rightly so. And I thought these other women deserve to live on too. And then I just have to end by showing you what I think is the best photograph of Harriet Tubman. Just, really, really something. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ms. Wickenden. We would like to take some questions now, just a few. We have people watching at home, so if you're watching at home and would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat. If you're here and would like to ask a question, please step up to the microphone so the people at home can hear you. We have one from the audience at home. Did you find anything that seemed especially haunting to you, given the way the country is divided today? What did you find that has stuck in your mind as being really pertinent still?
It evolved over time. It took me so long to write this book. It took 7 years. I have a full-time job, and I had to go to all these different collections. It took a long time. So when I started writing the book, Barack Obama was president, and it just looked like, I thought, wow, if these women were alive today, imagine what they would be thinking. And then it looked as though Hillary Clinton was going to be the first woman president, and I thought, their legacy lives on. This is remarkable. And I was finishing it when Donald Trump became president, and by then we were seeing racism, come to the fore again. But we were also seeing more grassroots activism. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. And again, none of this would have surprised these women. They knew they were in it for the long haul. It became clear pretty early on that women were not going to get suffrage for a very long time. Susan B. Anthony said at one point, when they were arguing over what was going to be in the 15th Amendment, was it going to be black men and women, or was it just going to be black men? And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton went completely over the deep end on this. And Susan B. Anthony said, we won't get it for another 100 years. And then, of course, there was the attack on the Capitol on January 6th with the Confederate flag and, legions of people urged on by the President of the United States, people going into the Capitol, threatening to kill the Vice President, threatening to kill the Speaker of the House. And I really did feel that we were sort of feeling a civil war erupting again, and the divisions. A lot of journalists have said that the divisions in the country now are more severe than they've been since the 1850s, which is not to say there's going to be a civil war like this one, but it's dangerous. It's really dangerous. And voting rights are being suppressed again. I think 19 states have passed voter suppression laws. So writing this book has really made me much more zealous too, and I just really believe that we have to learn again what it is to be active citizens. We have to vote, and we have to help other people vote, among other things.
Thank you. Does anyone else have some? Oh, please go to the microphone.
So your family is from Auburn, and then the Sewards were there, and Harriet Tubman, they bought property from the Sewards. So today, is any of that property in any of your families? I mean, I don't know about today how it's gone on. Does Harriet Tubman's, she didn't have any children of her own, but are they still owners? Is your family, are the Sewards? I mean, is there any continuity for the property today in Auburn?
One of the great things about Auburn is that there's enormous continuity. My family, I'm sorry to say, did not do very well in the long run. They owned my grandmother's father owned a button factory, and it did very well for a number of years, and then it went completely under. They lost all their money. It was a very wealthy town, as you can tell. Beautiful old houses and everything. It then went into a decline during the sort of post-industrial era, and it's now kind of coming back again. But Harriet Tubman has 2 great-great-grandnieces who still live there. Martha Coffin Wright has I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the generations. He's now 92. He's an Osborne. He's a descendant of one of Martha's daughters. And the interesting thing about Martha's family is that they all continued the tradition of social activism. And so Martha's grandson became a very famous prison reformer named Thomas Mott Osborne. And the Osborne I know, this elderly gentleman, he has continued that work through something called the Osborne Foundation, and it helps prisoners sort of remake their lives once they get out of prison. And the Auburn State Prison is right there in town, and so that you can sort of see that influence there too. So my family isn't there anymore, although Woodruffs, that was my family. They too, they're buried right near where Martha's buried. So,
and the Sewards?
There's the wife of one of Seward's descendants. He wasn't called Seward because it was through the maternal line. He died recently, but I went down to it was at Onawasco Lake, and I went down to the country house that the Seward son had built, Will, who fought in the war, and this wonderful old cottage, and there were priceless paintings in this cottage by the lake, and Seward's original desk and all kinds of things. And they too have been over the years very active in the Seward House Museum and so on. They gave, the family gave the museum, so you now can go. And just finally, because this is important, because it is Harriet Tubman's bicentennial next week, the National Park Service has bought the property that Frances sold Harriet Tubman, and that Harriet later added to it, and so it is now co-owned by the National Park Service and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was Harriet's church. And the church is being restored, and the original house is being restored. And so it's still in the early stages, but there are lots of celebrations going on this month for Harriet Tubman. And then there's a sister site on the Eastern Shore for the National Park Service. So there are these 2 sites.
Oh, great.
Thank you very much. And we'll take one more question, ma'am.
I wondered about New York and its supposed propensity for radical activity. You think that was because they were just close to Canada, and so that became a natural part of the Underground Railroad trail?
Wow, nobody's ever asked me that before. That's a really interesting thought. That could be, but I think it's more that it was, you've probably heard about the Second Great Awakening, and as I said, the evangelical movement at the time was very radical left. It's not at all what it is today. And you've heard about these revival camp meetings. So those meetings were held all the way across that middle part of New York State, and they came through Auburn, and Lizette went to one of these camp meetings, and she and Frances thought they were too snobbish. But the truth is, these camp meetings, women were allowed to talk, and these revivalists believed that slavery was a sin, and they spoke out against slavery, and it was called the burned over district, this entire part of western New York State. So there were just these pockets of great radicalism, and you've heard of the Wesleyans. So the Wesleyans are a radical branch, or were, of the Methodist Church. They broke away from the church, which was too hierarchical, and it didn't give women, didn't let women do anything. So a lot of that legacy is still there. And Seneca Falls, you see it. I went to school in upstate New York. You see the bits and pieces of this still. But it's interesting. It was very, very conservative, most of it, and it wasn't until kind of the mid to late 1850s that, like Syracuse, parts of Syracuse really rebelled against the Fugitive Slave Act. They hated these Southerners slave catchers coming into their state and taking, these were neighbors of theirs. These were people who had been working, in shops, and, the middle-class people who lived next door to them. And so conservative farmers would protect these people from being seized. And there were, uprisings when a slave was caught. People would, in the city, and this happened in a number of cities in New York State, would band together and they'd rescue them. So I talk about two of these very famous rescues in the book.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Wickenden's book will be for sale in the hall, and she'll be available for signing and probably a couple more very quick questions while she does that. Thank you.